Hello and welcome. So today we are going to be talking all about Oliver Cromwell's head. For those of you who don't know, Oliver Cromwell was Lord Protector of England from 1653 to 1658, while England was a republic after the execution of King Charles I. Now I know Oliver is not technically a king, but he ruled as if he was a king. He was offered the crown and his nickname was a king in all but name. So that's why he is being included. After Oliver Cromwell died, his son Richard became Lord Protector for about 9 months, but Richard wasn't very good at the job and he didn't enjoy it, so he gave it up. So Parliament asked King Charles I's son Charles to come back to England and be king, becoming King Charles II. So Charles agreed and he came back to be monarch, but as you can imagine, Charles was not too happy about the fact that his father had been executed and he wanted revenge on the men that allowed this to happen. So 12 of the men that had ordered King Charles I's execution were still alive, so they were arrested, tried and sentenced to be executed as traitors, where they were hung, drawn and quartered. But 3 of the men who had ordered the execution of King Charles I were dead. They were John Bradshaw, Henry Urton and Oliver Cromwell. Now the fact that these men were dead did not put off Charles II from getting his revenge, so Parliament ordered that these 3 men be tried posthumously. So the bodies were dug up, they were put on trial, found guilty and executed by being hung, drawn and quartered. So after their heads had been cut off, they were put on a spike and put above Westminster Hall, and there they stayed till late 1680s. So in the late 1680s there was this massive storm, and this storm broke the spike that Oliver Cromwell's head was on, causing Oliver's head to fall to the ground. The head was picked up by a centennial who was guarding the Exchequer's office, and he took it home with him and put it up his chimney. Now people were looking for Oliver's head and there was a quite substantial reward for its return, but the centennial was afraid to say that he had it and so he kept it hidden. We don't really know what happened to the head until 1710, when it came to be in the possession of Claudius de Puy, who was a collector of curiosities, and he displayed it in his private museum in London. De Puy died in 1738, and by the end of the century it had come into the possession of a failed comic actor and drunkard called Samuel Russell, who may have been an ancestor of Cromwell. A goldsmith, clockmaker and toy maker called James Cock wanted Oliver's head, and he actually offered Samuel Russell £100 for it, but Samuel didn't want to give the head up, even though he was in debt and this £100 would have helped him. Now Samuel Russell didn't take great care of Oliver's head. When he had his drunken parties, he would often pass around the head for people to look at, and it ended up getting a bit damaged. Samuel ended up offering Oliver's head to the master of Sidney Sussex College in Cambridge, where Oliver Cromwell went to university, but the master of the college wasn't interested in having the head. But James Cox still wanted Oliver's head, so what he started to do was to lend Samuel Russell little bits of money, and soon this money mounted up to £100, and when it did, James Cox called in the debt, but Samuel Russell, being unable to pay this debt, instead had to give James Cox Oliver's head. So James Cox actually ended up selling Oliver's head in 1799 to 3 brothers whose surname was Hughes. They were actually interested in starting their own display about Oliver Cromwell in Bond Street, but their display was a failure because their ticket prices were too high, and a rumour started to go around that the head was actually fake. Now, despite the failure of their exhibit, one of the brother Hughes's daughter would still show off Oliver's head to whoever wanted to see it. Sir Joseph Banks, a naturalist and botanist, was offered Oliver's head, but he refused it, saying he desired to be excused from seeing the remains of that old venomous Republican, the mention of whose very name made his blood boil with indignation. William Bullock, a naturalist and antiquarian, did consider buying Oliver's head, but he didn't in the end. In 1815, Oliver's head ended up being sold privately to Josiah Henry Wilkinson, and there it stayed in the family. In 1845, Thomas Carlyle, who was publishing a book called Letters and Speeches of Oliver Cromwell, asked to see the head, but he didn't. Instead, he wrote a scathing report diminishing the authenticity of the head based on what a friend who saw it had said. But George Rawlinson, a physician and zoologist, examined the head, and he said that it was definitely the real head of Oliver Cromwell. Around the same time, another skull called the Ashmolean skull was being examined as to whether this was the head of Oliver Cromwell, but this was proved to be a fake. In 1911, both heads were examined again, and the Ashmolean one was definitely said to be a fake, but the archaeologists said that they couldn't really say whether or not the head of Oliver Cromwell was actually his head. But then a full scientific investigation was done on the Wilkinson's head, and this determined that the skull that they had was definitely that of Oliver Cromwell. In the late 1950s, the owner of the head, Horace Wilkinson, decided that he wanted to have a proper burial for Oliver's head, so he contacted Sydney Sussex College again, and they welcomed the burial. Oliver Cromwell's head was interred in a secret location in the antechapel at Sydney Sussex College on the 25th of March 1960 with only a few witnesses. The burial was not actually announced to the public until October 1962. So that's the story of Oliver Cromwell's head and little journey that it went on. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.